All right, hi, my name's Eric Multanen, and I'm here to cover the topic of Openflow multi-writer issues. This was a topic that I think actually Uri Elzer kicked off maybe 6 months ago, and we had a number of discussions in the community. And one of our other engineers, E. Young, did some work in this area, and so he could not be here today. So I'll present the material that, the work that he's done. And I think what we'd like to do is, I'll run through the slides, kind of talk about a little bit of recap what the discussion has been in the past, over the last few months, the work that E's done, and then I think we'd like to see maybe how that work might fit in with some of this new stuff that we've been hearing about, the Genius project and so forth, because it sounds like there's some alignment there. So when we talked about this before, it was basically the observation was there's multiple applications in OpenDaylight that all want to control the Openflow tables, and if they're all controlling these things independently, there's going to be collisions. They're not going to work together and so forth. So it's also called we all called it the app coexistence problem. Few of the issues, of course, table 0 is one of the key tables, and everything has to come in through table 0, so there's some issues of how do you coordinate and deal with conflicts there. Every app tends to have its own set of pipelines, tables that it expects to have. NetVert has a series, SFC, so on. And then I guess flow IDs and cookies you might conflict with your usage of those numbers there. And he included a list of a lot of the folks who were in some of the meetings. If you're not on there but were involved, he's not trying to not recognize you, but a lot of these folks were involved in previous discussions. So the work that E did is he's proposed this idea of having kind of a layer that sits above Openflow to, I guess, coordinate the issues, or coordinate the tables and the usage of the tables. And basically provides an API that the different apps and different pipelines can use to talk to that layer. And included in that could be the detection of conflicts of Openflow rules, and I think that was kind of an option or possible thing that could be done.
Multiple projects, multiple apps writing to the single Openflow table? Or?
Yeah, in this case, the question is what does multiple projects mean? The focus here was really multiple OpenDaylight projects. So service function chaining has a set of tables, NetVert has a set of tables, group-based policy. Before some of these things started getting integrated together, everybody kind of assumed that they owned the table space and they would do what they wanted. If you want multiple projects to work together, you have to come up with a thing. And there, various solutions have been done sort of very specifically. Group-based policy, SFC work together, NetVert, SFC work together, but very, very specific solutions. The idea here was to come up with something a little more generically useful. Okay, this slide, it's going to be hard for anybody to read from a distance. Basically, it pictorially shows, I think, 3 sort of different, similar, possibly different approaches of how to break down the problem that were discussed in many of the meetings we've had over the last few months. The first 2, to me, are relatively similar. Basically, the colors here represent different projects or apps and their associated pipelines. And so the proposal 1 was basically in table 0, each project kind of has its little space or set of flows, and then the packets go through and go off to their pipeline and can get recirculated at the end and come back into table 0. The difference with table 2, as he explained it to me last week, is in this case the table 0 is more controlled by his concept of the Openflow programmer, this new layer and it's the apps talk to that layer, and then that layer sort of coordinates. Okay, who's got, he has this concept called table spaces, I believe is the term. But again, packets come into table 0, get sent to their pipeline, circulate back around, and may go into another pipeline based on the metadata that's now present in the packet.
Is there a priority if multiple entities are trying to get into table 0, right? So only one match is going to happen, but what about the priority?
Yeah, I think it seems to me like that has to be one of the things that has to be managed by this layer, like maybe, and I touched on it yesterday, I think, too. It's kind of a difficult problem to say which priority. Somebody has to know and configure things to say, okay, this priority is going to be, or this project's more priority than that project, and so forth. But yeah, I think this layer, such a layer would need to handle that. So.
Yeah, somebody has to give the features order.
Right. Right.
The table 0 in general will have a lot of conflict in this case, but I guess what we see is saying is that you can have the flow conflict mechanism, detection mechanism to handle the conflicts.
So if there is a conflict, you want to invoke some function. Is that what you're saying? And then it will.
Yes, exactly. That's what.
Yeah. Well, I think that from what I've seen of looking at what E's actually done so far is his API, in principle, has the ability to say when I'm putting a flow in, I can say check for conflicts within my project. So so flows that my project is putting in, check within, I guess, that range of priorities and the matches and all that to see, am I putting in something that's going to conflict? And I presume it could be extended. I don't think he's got that far yet. But it could.
But one basic issue is that when you push flows into a table, you can't specify any order, right? Today?
Oh,
Correct.
In any
sure.
specific table, it just gets sort of placed. So there's no reasonable amount of control you can have on how the table 0 entries are laid out, right? I mean, as long as they're all sharing the space, there's no priority you can do at the open flow level on how these sort of entries are laid, because open flow programming into a table has no priority semantics associated with it.
There is a priority, right?
But
Right now we don't have any mechanism which will enforce the priority.
yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Do you mean within projects?
No, within just the flow programming on a table.
Right. But I mean, you.
Rules have a priority.
Yes.
And the priority in the Openflow rules does work.
Yes, it does.
So are you talking about priorities between projects?
Yeah,
I think it's the priority between the projects.
Which is we don't have an entity which does assigns a particular priority to conflict resolution or within OpenFlow or assigns priorities to say OVSDB will have this priority, this GBP will have other priorities.
It's the same thing. I think there has to be priority in which whose rules get applied first. If it will be SDV or something else, then
Wouldn't that be in the metadata? That's where you define, how you want to prioritize these projects. Because you're going to have different table space.
It's not even that clear because
Yeah.
even within different projects, you might, you might have flows interleaved where you have, say maybe some low priority OVSDB flows, some medium priority SFC flows, and some high priority OVSDB flows, for example. So it's just it's a little more complicated
Right.
than just prioritizing projects, in my opinion.
I think it's generally a difficult problem to solve.
I agree with that. So what you said, Andre, was basically if I had multiple projects, 2 projects might each have sort of 3 groups of priorities that they care about, and then those groups could potentially be interleaved, right? So
Well,
I
multiple projects could have the same issue where they have different priorities. So we also need priority between different projects, which is applied first and the other one.
Right, yeah, and the problem deciding what order those things come in, the best I think I've heard is configuration file somewhere of somebody having to, if you had some kind of mechanism or API layer, whatever, that gave you some of those kinds of services, give me a group of priorities and some way to configure how that's going to come out, something. Yeah, I mean, I heard some of those topics from the discussion yesterday, so. Right. Yeah, so I think, okay, we talked about 1 and 2. 3, I think, was, basically the key thing, I think, with 3 that I recall was instead of sort of doing a recirculate, it was basically try to lay the series of project pipelines out in a sequence. I think Colin had that because some devices may not be able to do a recirculate, so.
If multiple applications want to use the same OVS switch or conflicting rules that we say, okay, you're not allowed to because there's some other application which is already has a rule in, let's say, table 0 or table 1, which is not going to work with that.
I guess I don't know, because if different projects can come in and say, give me a space to put something in table 0, space meaning maybe a range of priorities, and they're all different.
The user wouldn't know if there's a conflict or he's going to shoot himself in the foot. So it's better not to allow situations where it may not actually work.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe later somewhere in here, E has this idea of that the table 0 rules have to be fairly precisely defined. I mean, if you put something really generic in table 0 and it's a high priority, then it kind of, high or low, I forget which takes precedence, but.
We were talking earlier about, first of all, just providing a detection mechanism for whatever conflict you may detect. It's probably going to be a little bit complicated to really resolve those, but at least if you provide this heads up while you are really getting all of those applications that are trying to manipulate a given vSwitch, at least there is an indication to some control plane that later on could be percolating to a user via whatever way you decide. That gives you the first level of protection. This issue of really shared resource and how multiple applications that have not been coordinated before going to address that, there's no generic solution, or the complexity is such that we don't really need to engage with that, I think.
This slide shows just a real kind of high-level pictorial view of this layer that he's proposing, and I guess he doesn't show the actual Openflow, but I think that would be below, and then, or maybe that is the Openflow plugin flow programmer. Then he actually made the point, I don't know if it came across in some of the previous discussions, is he kind of felt that any of those 3 API solutions from the previous slide were all potentially supportable. It's just, which one people were most interested in. I believe the work that he's done to date is mainly around proposal 2, the recirculation one with table 0 being managed by the programmer layer. So, okay, so he showed some sample APIs here. I don't think I want to talk about those unless anybody else does. Let's see, table 0 is special. Okay, so the Openflow programmer, would act as kind of an arbiter for this table 0, and So I mentioned flow space, so he has a thing about creating a flow space. He can enforce a strict conflict detection. The assumption is every project will have its own flow space, then those would not overlap with each other. And then the rules for a particular thing would steer the packet based on a match into that particular project's initial pipeline segment. And then then the last one there was what I mentioned before. The rules would need to be fairly fine-grained in the table 0 especially to kind of make sure they went to the right spot. Especially initially when there's no metadata or something that, maybe, that recirculation idea, when you get to the end, you could put something in pretty specific to get it to the right spot on the way back around.
About this pipeline arbitration thing, that is where your interface manager would be something which could work on the table 0 problem. So that's so overall this problem has two components of it. One is the table 0 problem, and which would be solved by the interface manager, and the second one is what he is talking about is this resource management, the flow conflict detection, and these common things.
Okay. I'm not sure I caught it, but
Well, actually, what Amit is trying to say is there are two parts to it, right?
Right.
One is the table 0 programming, wherein it becomes the arbitrator and then it tries to do, okay? And the other one is the conflict resolution. For example, if two applications comes with the same priority, if they program it, there has to be an independent entity that would essentially do a conflict resolution and then provide it the necessary things, right? So he was saying that one part is this, and the other part is
Sure.
essentially like a helper function, which would essentially provide all the necessary things.
right. And I guess, the first point was even what you said earlier is even if you don't resolve it, at least detect it, flag it or something, and say, yeah, there's going to be a conflict here.
So I mean that's what I was going to bring about. If you assign a specific priority to a service, you could presumably leave any conflict resolution within the service to the service and not worry about it at the flow level. And
Right,
between services, since the priorities are different, you assume there's no conflict at all, right?
It-
Yeah.
Multiple services you want to match on the same packet. I want
Right.
One IP address, whatever, IP address A. And this service wants IP address A as well. That's a conflict.
Except the priority. Right.
Yeah. Is this on?
Right.
But there is no mediation layer today that would essentially do the service. Yeah.
So actually, I was going to say, we also need a resource kind of a manager, which will allocate the table 0 to this application. Table 1 to OSDB, table 2 is to GBP, etc. So we also need a resource manager which will handle the resources for this.
Table resources, right?
Yeah, the table resources.
But that's
The
more like-
pipeline discovery and
more like you agree on a particular,
Yeah.
for example, how you agree on the ports, right? So for example, you say that port X is for this particular service, port Y is for. So similarly, in that case, you need to do like a pre-processing type of thing where you agree upon that the applications would essentially need to provide this information so that this resource manager would essentially do that allocation, right?
So going back to the type of conflicts that could happen, there could be, as Brady mentioned, there could be that you have two services that are really trying to say something different about the same subset of the traffic. It could be actually also order dependency, that you have to do processing A before processing B, because when you look at the cardinality of the rules inside Openflow, depends on the action you're taking. if you're doing something forward and then drop, obviously the meaning would be the outcome is going to be very different if you first did the drop and then you're trying to do the forward. So there are different types of conflicts, and we discussed that at length, when we first started working on this following the last summit we had in the summer. What I believe we have today is some ad hoc solution that really allows group-based policy, SFC, and NetVIR to coexist. And the question is what makes sense for us to take as a next step towards a more generic solution. I don't think we could resolve all conflicts, and I don't think we are going to get to a situation where you have full automation and somebody could simply go drive some application, because the meaning of that is that you need to actually go scan all the rules, make sure there are no conflicts, etc. It's too much work to do. Probably there needs to be some coordination that we all agree, because this is centrally managed as a project under OpenDaylight, but we could remove some of the burden. For instance, one of the problems have been when we were working on SFC in the context of group-based policy and NetVIR was that some people made actually a hardwired assumption that I'm going to use table 10 and then I'm going to use table 20 and now try to move me around. No, I have to go change my code. So there's some disciplines and agreement that we need to have so that projects would be able to share that resource in a little bit easier way than, oh, let's manually move things around.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I think that's about right.
So there, well-defined semantics for every table of the OpenFlow today.
it's not really.
Oh, you mean within OpenDaylight?
Yes, within,
There is, you can do anything in any table.
yeah.
There are other devices that it's hard to do hardware devices that have limitations.
But what do you assumption of
No. No, and like Andre's point about OVS, all the tables are essentially identical, and all our tables are like essentially have every possible functionality available. But the hardware switches will you actually need to do the pipeline discovery and able to.
We have a proposal where we're talking about table 0 for one service, table 2 for a different service. So are you guys making an assumption where,
So this particular proposal actually makes the assumption that you're using an OVS switch.
right?
Or switch which has essentially all the tables are almost identical. Sorry. So this particular proposal, these proposals, this set of proposals, they are assuming that we are using OVS or an Openflow switch which has identical like all the tables are identical in functionality, and each of them have all kinds of capability.
I think some of it could apply to other types of devices that have special purpose. You might have just within a switch, a hardware switch. You could have different applications programming the different tables potentially. I don't know, but yeah, we're mainly looking at OVS.
All right. So E has some code. There's actually it's written a few months back. The number one there's the key Garrett. It has kind of the basic OpenFlow programmer layer that he talks about here in the slides. It appears like there's a fair amount of code for doing conflict detection of all the different kinds of header fields and stuff. That looks like a good chunk of the different files that are present in the code. He also has a couple Garretts that just kind of showed how, I think he did some sort of proof of concept integration of SFC and group-based policy at the time, a few months back, to kind of show here's what it takes to change this code to use this programmer layer. And it was, I don't know, a couple dozen lines of code. Didn't look like a huge amount of work. So that represents the state of what he had done. I think he was working initially to get this into the Openflow plugin, and I think some of the feedback was we didn't have any real. The group-based policy SFC wasn't really a great use case of this, because I guess the way that works is they didn't really collide in the same vSwitch. So I think the NetVert OVSDB was probably a better case, but I think for Beryllium you guys just dealt with it in a much more direct manner. So. Which is fine, I think, for Beryllium. So features of this code base is he doesn't, you talked about resource management, like table IDs, proof of concept code, he just statically assigned some stuff. I would imagine that you'd want to have an API where projects could say, give me 5 tables or something, and that kind of thing. Flow space concept, like I said, I believe that's really just a segmentation by priorities. That's what I think it is. Flow conflict, like I mentioned, and then table 0 needs to be distinguished by pretty fine-grained rules. Then I think the final thing is really next steps. He's talking here, some of the next steps, he's on our SFC group of folks, so they're kind of waiting on some of the NSH support that was kind of gating. I didn't see how that necessarily applied directly to flow, conflict detection, but kind of affected their sequence of work. I guess the key point here is to talk about what's the preferred path forward for boron timeframe. Because I know that, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of this Genius project sounds like it had some fairly similar concepts and capabilities. So, but
we need to look at how make sure we're not going to duplicate any work here. And I think it would be great if we could get Yi to work together with the folks in the Genius project to see how we could get it all in one place and not avoid duplication.
Because I think you guys got a lot of work already done. Let's pull it into the Genius project, and I think if he could get with you guys and say, well, okay, maybe he did some parts that you guys haven't addressed, vice versa.
Yeah. So part of the conversation yesterday, if I got it right, was about the example that has been used was that. Full mesh or partial mesh of tunnels as an example, and then that is obviously a little bit orthogonal to this. But what was more relevant is that we want to have multiple applications that are trying to use the same tunnel. How do we expose that? The concepts that we were trying to bring forward in this conversation are probably a little bit larger than that, but like always, the best way to make forward progress is with a concrete example in hand. So I think that we would be interested in working with you so that we actually kind of split the Genius into the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain. And in one of those hemispheres, we should be taking the next steps towards conflict detection or how we arrange the table format. But it would take support from other projects as well, because we would need SFC, GBP, NetVirt to agree to whatever decisions we are trying to take over here.
Yeah, just to add, as part of the presentation, we also covered on the dispatcher part, the service dispatcher part. That in a way touches the similar thing. Probably we can discuss and we can explain you how we have approached this particular issue.
All right. Andre has.
Yeah, so I agree. It'd be a good idea to get Yi and others working with the Genius project. I personally think that so this was a lot of good work. I think it's really hard to detect, to do all of the conflict resolution at the Openflow level. And I think the bulk of that work ought to be done at a higher level, more based on, services, requesting higher level services, and then let, like in this case, they're talking about using the interface manager to actually figure out what flows need to be programmed, and specifically in table 0. But then also, there was the tunnels, and then also the handoff between applications. So as you go from one application to another, they would manage how the flows that make that happen. And then, but there's probably still some work that could be done at this level to assist that. And I think it probably just divide up the work.
So the balance between the what can be done high level and the low level, this came up in the context of intent and other projects like that. And I'm holding the position, and we had many, I would say, arguments over that you cannot actually resolve everything at the top level. And even if you attempt to do that, you pretty much have to pass all the different policies down to exactly the way they are going to be expressed at the low level, and that's going to be, it's not feasible. You need to go understand. Nobody says everything is OVS even, and even if it is, what version and how the rules are being done, and maybe it's even offloaded to some piece of hardware. So I believe that if I'm kind of interpreting what you said, I believe you could relieve some of the problem with having understanding that these two services actually have nothing to do with each other. They are not really conflicting. I shouldn't be too worried, and then you reduce that level. But you would, with the architecture of Openflow, I don't believe there is a way to avoid the low-level work that we are talking about here. And if we are lucky, maybe we could constrain it and limit the effort over here, because I don't think anyone has any joy of trying to develop something very generic that we don't really need.
So, and yeah, I agree. Just come sit over there. I agree. I think the main problem that needs to be solved is this. The biggest one is this just table 0 problem, and the problem is when a packet comes in, which application gets it, and applications could then register. Their interface manager could provide an API that applications could use to register to receive the packets that they need to receive. And then it goes off into their pipeline that they control completely, and then when they're done with it, they might send it out or send it to another application.
Right, but just to put it in don't worry about that. It's sharing the table 0 mic is a problem. So actually, that would have been a solution if we were in agreement about a fixed data plane, where you have functionality 1, 2, 3, etc. And what I'm developing is functionality X, and you're developing functionality Y, but we understand how they are sequenced, and therefore we know the conflicts. There is no agreement. Nobody is willing to have that functionality really defined, which really means that when you have whatever number of applications and a new application shows up and is trying to share that, it's impossible to know in what way, shape, or form that application is going potentially to conflict with whatever rules another application is using. So we have the choice. There's another approach. The other approach, for instance, is taken by folks like OVN, where you actually have a single writer. Everything is centrally done, but this is not where we are with ODL. So
I see it as kind of the way we're moving with the interface manager, that the interface manager is the single writer for table 0, and it provides this mechanism to register for what you want to receive. And it's not solving the whole problem, but it's I think, taking, we did for the NetVert, GBP, and SFC, we did it all, handcrafted flows. And this is really just taking it to the next level, that you don't have to handcraft those flows. You could have an application that will do it for you, and you can register at a higher level. Everybody still has to kind of agree on how they're going to work together, at some level, and how things are going to hand it off. But it just kind of takes it another step, and I think will get us a long way.
Yeah, I think that in the boron phase, what we need is actually to get at least these 3 projects and the new project. Actually, we need everybody to agree that they're willing to actually move the code from where it exists right now. Otherwise, we're not going to get a community agreement on this. And so without all the GPP guys and NetVirt and SFC guys in the meeting here, I mean, we could talk, but they need to agree and move the code.
The SFC guy is here.
SFC and NetVirt's here. So.
I agree. We need to remember.
I have one question on the OpenFlow. So when I enable the OpenFlow by connecting the controller, the normal switching is disabled. I mean, is it part of the spec, or when all the rules will be deleted from the OpenFlow table?
You mean for an OpenFlow switch, we disable the normal rules? I think that will be dependent on the switch, right? Oh, yes. Yeah. Mm.
Let's say I install the normal flow, and then I try to, let's say I disconnect the controller and I reconnect. There's a time where all the rules are being deleted from the normal table. But I want the ability to basically.
So if it is there in a config store, it will be reinstalled. If probably I have an OpenFlow expert here, he can talk. If I'm wrong, if he has installed the normal flow, right, and config store. Yeah.
Let's say I don't connect the controller on the port 666.
Mm-hmm.
Then OVS will provide the default value switch behavior.
I can repeat him. He wants the normal switching behavior, so I suggested that install the normal flow in table 0, and then that should help you. That's what I'm suggesting him to do.
Way it will be installed again. I'm not sure how it is differently done.
So there might be 2 things, though. So he's asking this. So we're coming from our OpenDaylight point of view, which is you program the flows and configure data flow, and you connect, they'll get pushed. But it sounds like what you're saying is you've actually configured OBS manually or something. You put normal flow, then you connect it into OpenDaylight, and it got trashed.
Yes, so the default behavior, let's say if I don't connect the controller, channel will be the project page, right? So the set controller command, so the switch is in the learning mode and it forwards the packets as a learning switch. And let's say if I connect the controller using the set controller command, so the normal switching rule is deleted from the OpenFlow table. So what that means at that time, I have to manually configure all the flow rules for the forwarding to work. So what I'm really looking for is, just retain the normal learning switching behavior even when you connect or disconnect the control with the controller, so that the forwarding still continue to happen, and then I can insert whatever the flow rules I would like to insert. So that's what I'm looking for.
Well, are you putting it in secure mode, non-secure mode? Remember, there's a mode where you connect the switch, it'll trash all. Well, remember, OpenFlow by default, you got secure mode, non-secure mode, and if you configure the wrong mode, it'll trash all the flows. Basically, it says when you're disconnected or not, it'll wipe everything out. And I'm wondering if that's what's really, because OpenDaylight shouldn't be doing it, trashing flows unless it's told to.
Hybrid switch where part of the switch is OpenFlow and the part of the rest of the switch is non-OpenFlow. So I don't know how
the normal lead to behavior should continue at that point in time. So that is more of an obvious.
That won't happen because even normal's a flow, right?